Today, we're taking a look at one of the first truly mass-produced British military aircraft, becoming the backbone of the RAF's expansion program in the mid-1930s, and this was the Hawker Hart. The Hart was the outcome of Specification 12/26, which was issued back in May 1926. It called for the production of a daytime bomber that had a maximum speed in excess of 160 miles an hour, or 257 kilometers an hour. Now, this was a requirement which, at the time, most manufacturers felt was impossible with the current aero engines available. This specification also came about during a time of heightened apathy within the British aircraft industry. Time and again, manufacturers had submitted proposals, good, promising proposals, only to never make it past the prototyping phase. This was due to the conservative fiscal policy in the lean years following the end of the First World War, which meant that new, innovative designs were often sidelined due to cost, especially airframes that made use of metal structures. It also meant that manufacturers were having to rely on older and outdated engines, hence why many believed this new specification to be an impossibility. However, investigations were being made into using the Rolls-Royce Falcon F1 supercharged inline engine, and because of this, eventually, Avro, Hawker and Fairey submitted proposals. The Hawker design team, led by Sidney Cam, commenced work on the project in collaboration with Rolls-Royce, who also offered assistance to the others as well, and by December of 1926 their initial tender was ready for submission. The proposed design used the now familiar Hawker steel tube primary structure, single bay wings, and a split axle undercarriage with pneumatic shock absorbers. The submission was quickly accepted, and a mock-up was produced early in 1927. In this design, Sidney Cam introduced a new form of wing spar, consisting of top and bottom rolled steel strip booms connected by a light gauge plate weave. This spar gave maximum strength for minimum weight, since the materials were functioning near their permissible stress at full factored load. Now, putting that aside, during 1927 the design of the aircraft was modified several times. First, the heavy eye struts were replaced by much lighter and stronger end struts. Then, a cross-axle undercarriage with Vickers Oleo pneumatic shock absorbers was added instead. A pump-operated fuel system replaced the gravity-fed system. And, most importantly, the Rolls-Royce F11B engine was adopted instead. This engine differed fundamentally from the original Falcon, having the cylinder blocks cast in one single piece instead of individual cylinder casings. This improvement improved its strength and reduced the engine weight by something of around 60 pounds. As construction of the prototype began proper, the design sat as such. It was a single-bay biplane powered by the Rolls-Royce F11 water-cooled V12, the engine that would later become the Rolls-Royce Kestrel. It had, as the specification required, a metal structure, with a fuselage structure of steel tube covered by aluminium panels and fabric, with the wings having steel spars and duraluminum ribs also covered in fabric. The crew of two sat in an individual tandem cockpits, with the pilot sitting under the wing trailing edge and operating a single .303 caliber Vickers machine gun mounted on the port side of the cockpit. The observer sat behind the pilot and was armed with a single Lewis gun on a ring mount, while for bomb aiming he lay prone under the pilot's seat. In terms of ordnance, up to 520 pounds, or 240 kilos of bombs, could be carried under the aircraft's wings. Construction began at some point in mid-1927-ish, and the prototype was ready for its first flight in the summer of 1928. It was first flown by Flight Lieutenant P. George Bullman in June. It then went on to complete a series of flight trials over a period of 6 months before the existence of the Hawker Hart was announced, and it made its first public appearance at the Olympia Aero Show. Detailed service evaluations of the Hart began after this, and before the end of 1928, with the prototype visiting Martlesham Heath for no less than 8 separate trials in a 6-month period. It demonstrated good performance and handling, reaching 176 miles an hour, or 283 kilometers an hour in level flight, and a blistering 282 miles an hour, or 454 kilometers an hour in a vertical dive. These trials were held in direct competition, with those being completed with the Avro Antelope and the Fairy Fox Mark II. At the completion of the trials, the Hart was deemed to be the best of the batch, being superior in speed, handling, and ease of maintenance. Thus, an initial production order for 15 aircraft was placed to a new specification, 9/29, and these could be considered pre-production Harts, as it was felt that such a large leap in aircraft performance would produce some teething problems, both from the points of view of crew training and serviceability. Number 33 Bomber Squadron, based at Eastchurch, received 12 of these early Harts in January of 1930, which replaced their existing Hawker Horsleys. Very quickly the Hart showed to be a big improvement, and before the squadron had even completed working up, they placed second in the annual Bomber Command operational contests. Overnight, it had basically become the most capable bomber in the service, and in fact, it had actually become the most capable aircraft fielded by the RAF, full stop. No single fighter in service, or even about to enter service, could catch it, and the venerable Bristol Bulldog, the main fighter at the time, was 10 miles an hour slower. Because of this startling performance, one of the first Harts was sent across to India for evaluation to replace the aging fighters currently stationed there, specifically the Bristol fighter and the Armstrong Whitworth Siskin. This Hart, flown by Fred Raynham, performed well. However, during one of the flights, a local kite, as in the bird of prey kite, took exception to the fabric-clad, loud, noisy thing entering its territory and began a series of swooping attacks. In the aerial equivalent of David vs. Goliath, the kite actually did enough damage to bring the Hart down, and it was written off. Fred Raynham survived the ordeal, though I imagine he was a little embarrassed. Bird-related beatdowns aside, the Hart proved well suited to the environment, and an initial order was placed for 57 versions of the Hart India. This was a tropicalized version of the design, intended to cope better with the hotter, more humid climates found there, and the first of these was flown on September 7th, 1931. Meanwhile, further orders were being placed for the Hart for home service, and indeed, the Hart would form a core element of the RAF's mid-1930s expansion plan. A total of just 82 were ordered between 1930 and 1931, equipping number 12, 8, and 57 bomber squadrons, but more soon followed. This quickly put a strain on the Hawker production line, as work was also now in progress on the Hawker Fury, the existing Horsley, and the Tomtit, and Hart production was subcontracted to other manufacturers. The scale of Hart production itself was a big achievement for the time, when most aircraft were being built at maybe 100 or perhaps 200 examples if they were very, very successful. Westland built 43 Harts under contract, Boulton Paul built 106, Bristol 141, Gloucester 144, Vickers built 226, Avro managed 244, and Armstrong Whitworth produced a deeply impressive 456, which represented a massive commitment from such a firm. In addition to this, Hawker itself produced approximately 1,438 Harts across the different subvariants. At one time, in 1934, 7 out of every 8 aircraft delivered to the RAF were of Hawker design, while in 1936, at the height of the expansion plan, 3 out of 4 new squadrons being formed were being equipped with the Hawker Hart or one of its subvariants. The impending widespread acceptance of the Hart presented 2 problems. Firstly, it outclassed everything in the RAF inventory, which meant they needed a new fighter, And secondly, it outclassed everything in the RAF inventory, and thus any current training aircraft weren't good enough to prepare pilots for the raw, untamed fury of this new and fantastic machine. And so this led to the development of two things: the Hawker Fury, which we'll cover in another video, and a training version of the Hawker Hart. This was in fact a converted version of the Hawker Audax, which itself was another variant of the Hart, which had been designed for Army Corporation duties. Following evaluations of a prototype, and two other hastily converted models, the two-seat dual-control trainer was placed into service. Testing had revealed issues with the centre of gravity affecting the handling, it having shifted due to the removal of military equipment, and Hart trainers had a reduced sweep back on their upper wing. On production Harts it was 5 degrees, but on the trainers it was just 2.5, and this mostly solved the problem, and their handling was considered almost identical. In a short period of time, the Hart trainers formed the main equipment of the Advanced Training Wing at the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell, where they replaced the Armstrong-Whitworth Atlas trainers. Hart trainers were also sent to frontline squadrons for training in navigation, communication, and instrument flying. At the height of the expansion program, every home flying school would fly Harts, and its contribution in training the light bomber crews of the RAF cannot be overstated. In frontline service, the Hart served with numerous squadrons. It operated with numbers 6, 11, 12, 15, 18, 33, 39, 57, 60, and 142 Bomber Squadron. They operated with number 24 Communications Squadron, and numbers 600, 601, 605, and 610 Squadron of the Auxiliary Air Force. Though produced in massive numbers for the time, the Harts didn't see a great deal of exciting service, or action, during the interwar period. They were, however, produced in a great variety of variants, and a few export models were also produced as well. The offshoot versions of the Hart were the Audax, the aforementioned Army Corporation aircraft, the Demon, a fighter variant of the Hart, the Hardy, an appropriately named general-purpose and tropicalized version of the Hart, and the Osprey, which was a carrier-borne version. I'm not going to discuss these aircraft now, as I plan to cover them in a follow-up video which will come out within the next week or so. Export models of the Hart did not amount to too much, and this was because Hawker was still a private company until 1933, and it just didn't have the capacity to produce large quantities of aircraft for overseas customers whilst tending to the massive requirements of the RAF. There were, however, a few exceptions. In 1932, the Estonian government ordered 8 Hart bombers, which were delivered in the autumn of that year. They came with interchangeable wheel and float undercarriages, which was a design feature inherited from the Osprey. Not much is known about their service, but they were still listed as operational when they became involved during the Second World War. Harts operated by Sweden had a far more active life than most that were actually operated in British service. In 1934, Sweden ordered 4 Patton aircraft for evaluation, which were unique in being powered by the 580 horsepower Bristol Pegasus radial engine instead of the Rolls-Royce inline. Following successful testing, Sweden purchased a license to produce the aircraft, and at least 42 were built. When Russia invaded Finland in 1939, Swedish Harts formed part of the volunteer unit sent to assist their Finnish neighbour. By January 1940, at least 4 Harts were in action alongside other aircraft, including Gloucester Gladiators, and they were usually equipped with ski undercarriages due to the frozen conditions. In all, about 9 Harts took part in the Finnish campaign, carrying out reconnaissance patrols, bombing attacks on infantry columns, and other various strike missions. One of the Swedish Harts still survives today, and it can be found at the Swedish Air Force Museum. Another role that the Hart found itself heavily involved in was that of a testbed. With wide flying limits, good control at low speeds, and accommodation for a flight observer, Rolls-Royce purchased several ex-contract aircraft for engine testing. One Hart was used to test the Bristol Jupiter and Bristol Pegasus engines, until it came to a sudden and watery end in the English Channel, it having run into problems on the way back from the 1932 Paris Air Show. Another Hart was used during the early development of the troubled Rolls-Royce Goshawk, a steam-cooled engine that I've mentioned in a few videos, as it was imposed upon several manufacturers when the Air Ministry became a little bit obsessed with it. Now, this Hart used special strip condensers on the leading edge of the upper wing to assist with cooling. And this very quickly led to the installation of a canopy, as pilots took extreme exception to their faces being spattered by supercooled droplets of water, which was apparently quite painful. And this then led to canopies being fitted and tested with several other Harts as well. The two most notable Harts were registered GABMR and K3036. The latter was a vital testbed for the Rolls-Royce PV-12, which went on to become the famous Merlin engine. A significant amount of testing was done with this Hart, and it performed a large amount of the early flight development that contributed to the Merlin's success. The other Hart, GABMR, had one of the longest flying careers for this type of aircraft. Despite being the 13th Hart built, it was not unlucky at all. Apart from having flown with almost every type of the Kestrel engine built between 1930 and 1939, it was used during World War II, both as a photographic aircraft and as a pilot's ferry. It was also used as a demonstrator, and after the war, it even performed a variety of civilian roles, as well as being used for air races. It was still flying in the 1970s when it was transferred to the RAF Museum. There it can still be found, painted in a striking silver and yellow livery, and it isn't the only surviving one either. There is the aforementioned Swedish Hart, of course, and there is also a Hart trainer on display, as well as a couple of the Hawker Demons. One belongs to the Shuttleworth collection in Britain, and the other can be found at the Royal Australian Air Force Museum in Point Cook. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters, whose names you'll see here. Now, I'm currently working on a small backlog of videos to cover me during my overseas travel, so that's why things have been a little bit quiet on this end, but there shouldn't be too much of a gap in content moving forward. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier members, and a big thank you to a couple of those commanders who upgraded their pledges by a considerable amount. You know who you are, and thank you both very, very much. The support I've been getting from everyone, regular viewers and Patreon supporters alike, is absolutely heartwarming, and I cannot thank you all enough. But what I will say is that I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.